sad to announce for our current panel that we've moved them up. So, and they've graciously agreed to do that. So, Ryan, I'll hand it over to you, and we're going to talk about commingled lands. Excellent.
Well, thank you, Troy, and happy to move up to an earlier time slot. Not a problem. So appreciate the panelists all being here and being able to quickly fill in. But this afternoon, we're going to talk about commingled lands. And to start this panel off, I'd like to start with a little bit of an audience interaction portion. And I just have one statement I'm going to say, and I want everybody to, you should know the answer to it, but I'm going to say a phrase, an old adage, and I want you to say the answer for me out loud. Is everybody ready? Good fences make good neighbors. Good job. I thought everybody would know that. Well, what happens when you've got land like we do, commingled across the West, and we don't have any fences? Doesn't mean that we can't be good neighbors with each other. It just means we have to work a lot harder, coordinate a lot more, and do a lot more things to make sure we are good neighbors with our commingled lands across the state of South Dakota and a lot of our western states. And so we're not going to go out there and put in fences to be good neighbors, but the purpose of our panel today is to talk about commingled lands, talk about the issues that come up, and try and find ways that we can all be good neighbors to each other. When I was visiting with these panelists in advance and sent them an email talking about what topics are there with commingled lands, it took about 30 seconds to come up with a pretty broad list of things, if you're thinking of questions for later, as to things that impact commingled lands. And a very brief list, it would be water, fencing, access, noxious weeds, prairie dogs, prescribed burns, grazing stocking rates, resource management plans, oil and gas development, endangered species, and hunting and recreation. All those things, the management or interaction of all of those are impacted by commingled land ownership, federal, state, and private. And so we're going to ask each of our panelists to open up with a couple of minutes of remarks and talk about their experience with commingled lands, and then we'll go on into questions. We'll start with Dan, since he's sitting next to me.
And I was worried about sitting next to the commissioner, so please note that I borrowed a suit jacket for the day so that sartorially we would match. So from a U.S. Forest Service perspective in the state, the agency manages about 2 million acres. That equates to about 4% of the land surface. But of course, that's not in one chunk. It's divided up into lots of chunks. And in fact, we have ground National Forest System land in, I think, 13 counties, which is about, what, a fifth of the total. Those lands are in 4 of our administrative units: the Black Hills National Forest, the Custer-Gallatin National Forest in the northwest corner of the state, the Dakota Prairie Grasslands, which is right on the border of the 2 Dakotas, and then the Nebraska National Forests and Grasslands, which, as previously mentioned, manage the Buffalo Gap National Grassland and the Fort Pierre National Grassland where I work. So when we talk about intermingling, in terms of the juxtaposition of those different land ownerships, if you drew a line around the exterior boundary of the Black Hills, within that polygon, about 80% would be National Forest System land. In contrast, the Fort Pierre National Grassland, right in the middle of the state, if you drew a line around that exterior boundary, about 55% or so is National Forest System land. So we're quite intermingled in this state. The neighbors are just a laundry list. In terms of acreage and number of people involved, private landowners are overwhelmingly our most numerous neighbors. But we also abut some county land up in Harding County, for example, state land, South Dakota Game, Fish, and Parks, and then of course the school lands. We also abut other federal agencies. We also abut and are intermingled with several tribes: the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe, the Pine Ridge Sioux Tribe. So to close out my introductory remarks, I just wanted to highlight some examples of how we're dealing with what Ryan was just talking about, this co-mingling and being cheek to jowl with so many neighbors. I think the wonderful example we've already heard a lot about. That's a Black Hills National Forest All Lands Initiative. And that's the mountain pine beetle that the governor spoke of and the last panel spoke of. Another example would be the Custer-Gallatin National Forest. The North Cave Hills, there's the abandoned uranium mines where there's environmental degradation happening on the National Forest System lands and on the neighboring private lands due to some of the management from a half century ago. And the U.S. Forest Service is working hand in glove with the state, South Dakota Department of Environment, Natural Resources, and some of those neighbors to try to solve that common problem. Another example from the Dakota Prairie Grasslands would be in the Grand River National Grassland up in mostly Perkins and Corson County. The Grand River Cooperative Grazing Association actually has fee title lands, and some of those lands are immediately adjacent to the federal livestock grazing allotments, and they're managed in conjunction with, getting back to Ryan's point. The association self-assesses an additional charge to their members for those grazing privileges. And then they use that money to hire some permanent staff. And that staff is focused on maintaining the range infrastructure on both properties, doing some cooperative weed control, even doing some cooperative monitoring. An example of working with some tribes would be from the Fort Pierre National Grassland. Again, we're intermingled with the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. We meet with them once a year for meeting in a potluck so that the right hand knows what the left is doing. We then have initiated several projects. So we have grassland bird research going on right now. We have cooperative satellite telemetry on pronghorn going on right now. A few years ago, the tribe got a grant. They then matched that grant with their own money and then used that money to hire 2 youth crews, one of which did habitat improvement work on one side of the fence, on the tribal side. And the other crew they actually sent to the National Grassland. And they did the same work there because, as was previously mentioned by Carl, that wildlife doesn't care what the land ownership is. They're moving back and forth. Another example of working beyond those property boundaries is on the Buffalo Gap National Grassland. The National Park Service and National Forest Service have grounds immediately adjacent to each other. And we have some common management objectives to providing public service on interpretation. And so those offices of the Badlands National Park, the Minuteman Missile National Historic Site, and the National Grassland Visitor are sharing staff back and forth so that, again, they can be as responsive as possible. And so concluding my remarks, this intermingled lands, it really is a challenge, isn't it? But I think with good faith and recognition that we do have some differing missions, some differing management objectives, that we can still go a long way on accomplishing some universal goals.
Thank you, Dan. We'll just keep going down the line with Chip. Chip Kimball is the regional BLM manager out of Belfouche.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me adjust the microphone here. I would like to say first that the BLM is kind of a minor player where federal lands are considered in North Dakota. We've got about 274,000 surface acres within the state, but we have over 1.7 million acres of mineral estate that we administer across all of South Dakota. The vast majority of our surface acreage is in fact, 98% is West River in South Dakota for obvious reasons. The rest is primarily croplands. And BLM is traditionally managing grasslands more than it is forest. However, in South Dakota, we do have portions of the Black Hills. Most of our land is in Butte County, in South Dakota. In fact, over 50% of our land in South Dakota is in Butte County, and that accounts for about 10% of the surface acreage in that county. We have approximately, and I've written numbers down, 32,000 acres that are within the 5 counties surrounding the Black Hills, being Meade, Lawrence, Pennington, Custer. But we've got about 165,000 acres of minerals estate that we manage within the Black Hills. So that's a good portion of what we do in our work in the hills is involved with. So we have to work closely with the surface landowners in those areas. So I think that commingled lands perhaps not only addresses surface occupancy, but also subsurface ownership. Many of you were involved with our recent resource management plan completion. We did finish that last year. And while it does address all of our management activities across the state, including recreation, all of our minerals activities, and certainly habitat management, you also are well aware probably that the sage grouse became a very large issue within the resource management planning across 11 Western states, including South Dakota. For us, what that means is that by doing the management actions that we took in play, and the Forest Service was also involved in this, we were able to prevent the sage grouse from needing to be listed right this moment. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is going to go back and review that again in another 5 years. So the idea here was that the federal agencies would take the bulk of the management responsibilities and remove that from the private landowners. There's an awful lot that goes into play there, and it's going to dramatically change the availability for management within the sage grouse areas, primarily again in Butte County and some in Hardin County. It has to do with pipelines and those type things. It has less to do with grazing. Grazing has very little impact there. It has a lot to do with particularly the oil and gas industry. So we're going to have to work very, very closely with our neighbors on those issues. An upcoming plan that we're currently working on is the travel management plan, and we've got that divided into sections. One is going to be in what we call the exemption area here in the Black Hills, which is the Deadwood Lead area. And travel management is primarily looking at what routes currently exist within federal lands, within BLM administered federal lands, I should say. And that being roads, trails, 2 tracks, hiking trails, anything that might be considered a pathway. And evaluating, are those needed, are those not needed? And for obvious reasons, especially considering the commingled lands within the Black Hills, it's going to have a dramatic impact potentially on our adjoining landowners. We're going to have to work very, very closely with all of our neighbors to make sure that those impacts benefit everyone. We have no intention of removing access to anybody to anything what they need, but we need everyone to participate in that process in order to make sure that that doesn't occur accidentally. So a lot of our management actions are affected by actions of the outside landowners, sage grouse, for example, which there's, like I said, there's a lot of calculations that go into play. There's a disturbance cap to be involved in things. But actions that take place on other lands outside of BLM can have very dramatic impacts where that's concerned on the way we go about managing our property. But also in things like the travel management planning, actions that we take can impact our neighbors. So that's where this commingled land really comes into play. And we have to work very, very closely together to make sure that we're, not making management decisions that are to people's detriment. Other than that, I'll be happy to, when it's my turn, be happy to address questions. And thank you for inviting us.
Thank you, Chip. We'll move on to Chance.
Okay. I guess as just introduction, my name's Chance Davis. I ranch about 15 miles north of Belfouche. Got about 12,000 acres of deeded ground and I think it's 1,920 acres of BLM that that's right in the middle of that. I figured it out one time. If I fenced it out, there would be 19 and a half miles of fence to go around those 1,900 acres. If I could build fence on it, which I can't. But, and I guess probably the best way for me to describe what it's like is use an analogy of that someone else owns part of your house. They've got a little bit of the living room, maybe part of the hallway, and the front door. And fortunately, they don't charge very much for it, but anyone that wants to can come in the front door and do whatever they want to in that portion of the living room. And so I guess it's probably obvious that there's a lot of issues. Travel management being one of those. My particular chunk of BLM, the county road goes right through the middle of it. But then the trails coming off of that, they start on BLM, they end up on private, they might go back into BLM. So yeah, any travel management is going to be of something I'm closely monitoring, I guess. I hope so. But so, you know, for the most part, getting along with the BLM is easy. There's really very few issues. And like I said, grazing is pretty much it. And I guess the good thing about intermingled lands, and I'd say my place is fairly typical in Butte County, in that you take care of the BLM ground just like you do your private ground. There's no difference. You can't first of all, you can't manage it any differently anyway, but it's, you know, so everyone is committed to good management. I guess I was on the rack for 6 years. It seemed like 60, but and in that time was the first 6 years of the management plan, which is now in what, its 9th year. Well, okay. And
yes, but it is 9.
Yeah. So, and I faithfully attended those meetings. I have great empathy for the BLM people that have to go through that. It is a ridiculous process. There's no other way of saying it. And so I guess I would hope with whatever collaborative process or whatever, that someday someone will come up with a better system than what they're doing right now. So I guess with that, I'll pass it on.
And thank you, Chance. We'll turn it over to Eric Jennings.
Well, I am Eric Jennings. I am a product of the Black Hills. I live in a pretty small world, but I do know my little world fairly well. So I live in the north edge of the hills and near Spearfish, and my family has had private land and a grazing allotment in the northern Black Hills since the late 60s. I think I must have been about 4 or 5 years old when we obtained that property. So I've spent most of my life with it. I just divested myself of my grazing allotment 2 years ago. So but I do still have some private land up there that I run cattle on. I've always just been a cow-calf operation. Have utilized the forest permit for our summer grazing. It was a four-month season up there is what we got, but I ended up just because that was a part of the operation that I could not have full control over, I had to manage the rest of my operation around those 4 months. So it affected my calving dates and other management activities. We operate a couple hundred acres of private land surrounded by several thousand acres of public land. So the federal land management decisions and plans have a profound consequences on our private land management. The things that occur on the public land, how much logging occurs, or the travel management, all those things affect our public or private land. Just name a couple, like invasive species, whether it's plant or animal or insect. We had to do a pretty extensive logging in 2013 just because the mountain pine beetle were so bad in the forest. They were flying over to our private land. It wasn't the opportune time to do the logging on there. It would have been better to have the trees grow a little more. We could have maybe got a little better price, but it was a self-defense measure. We were going to take the trees or the bugs were. So I think that was a consequence of the public land management, not addressing the mountain pine beetle situation soon enough. I think most of us understand invasive plant species. Canada thistle, for one, is very prevalent in the Black Hills, and we certainly have to do more than we would normally have to on our private land to control Canada thistle, just because it's blowing in from the public land. You get outside of the Black Hills, and certainly prairie dogs are a big issue. They can't control them on the public land, but you end up doing a lot more control on your private land, where if it was private land, you could go in there and essentially wipe them out. But with the public land situation, you just have a constant source of them coming in. Because of the consequences on the private land that we face from the public land, I've become involved. I should say I came back to the ranching operation in 1988 and operated it since then, and it became very apparent to me that we needed to be involved in as much public land management as we could. I got involved in the Spearfish Livestock Association, it's one of my favorite organizations. It's a group of permittees in the Northern Hills that all have national forest grazing allotments. I'm pretty sure this is our 99th annual meeting that will occur next month. And we have a wonderful relationship with the Forest Service, Game and Fish Parks, whoever affects or is being affected on the national forest. It's a pretty small group, and a pretty small meeting. It's just an annual meeting, but if we have an issue, we invite the Forest Service in. The Forest Service and Game and Fish always get invited to our meetings, and we've ended up with a real good relationship. I see Craig Bobzine here, and it's nice to be able to greet him friendly, and John and Shelley from Game and Fish. So we don't always agree on the issues, but we've always been able to sit down and discuss the issues, find out where each other's coming from, and leave in a friendly manner. I've also been involved in the Black Hills Regional Multiple Use Coalition, which is a group of commodity and recreational users of national forest and the regional BLMs also included in national grasslands. It's just user groups that we all get together and form an opinion, listening to each other's sides, so we can go in a unified voice towards the federal land managers, commenting on whether it's an EA, EIS, or just having conversations with them. And there again, we invite people to come in and talk to us to learn our side. I've also been involved in the Lawrence County Ag Committee of the Environmental Review Ordinance, which comes out of the paragraph from the NEPA document that says that, and I'll paraphrase this, but that the national or the public land managers need to be cognizant of the custom, culture, and economy of the local area with the management decisions that they make. And with this ordinance, then the local government, in this case, the Lawrence County Commission, should have a higher standing and be able to voice some concerns to the public land managers. I don't throw all these things out there because I'm running for public office or trying to gain your votes or anything, but it's part of what has to occur when you're a private landowner or a grazing permittee. And Chance is the same way. I mean, he's obviously was involved in the RAC and has been involved in other things. And if you want to be a responsible manager, those are the things that you have to do. You know, and it was a goal. And Chance had been working on the public land or the RAC deal, and I got involved into it about the time we started rewriting the forest plan for the Black Hills National Forest. And it was one of my goals to not have a permit anymore before we started rewriting that. And I'm happy to get out of the permit business so I don't have to go through that ordeal again. I will. I'll stop there, I believe.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Eric. Really appreciate that. And all of your opening remarks, very on point for the purpose of the panel and why we wanted to get together today, is to be able to share some of those examples and those stories. A lot of times, I guess, in my experience, I've been Commissioner of School and Public Lands for 2 years now, but I was the deputy a couple of years before that. Is sometimes we have a tendency, if we don't have meetings like this, to operate in silos where, you know, this is our area, we're doing our job, and every agency and people in the private sector are doing that as well. And so having these opportunities to have these cross connections, I think, are helpful for being able to continue those conversations. I know when I first took over as commissioner, folks like Dan, who managed the Fort Pierre National Grasslands, I had not met Dan before, and so I'd been working in the office a couple of years, but had never met Dan, hadn't had an opportunity to work together on any issues. And same thing with Chip and her predecessor. And so we kind of started realizing when sage grouse and some of these other issues were coming up that we needed to have a lot more interaction with on commingled lands with federal agencies. And just to share a few more examples before I go into questions, one of the first times I ever met Dan and worked with him on an issue is we had a lessee who had questions on stocking rates. And Dan mentioned we have different management objectives, and state school lands and trust lands utilize a higher grazing rate. We have a higher utilization capacity for what we allow for grazing on trust lands versus sometimes what they have on the grasslands. And when our lands are intermingled, our lessee, their permittee, thought they should maybe potentially be allowed some more animal unit months because they weren't getting enough credit for the school land. And so I met Dan, we talked through that issue. He was able to break down the math, and they were giving proper credit to the school and public lands for the carrying capacities and the numbers that we use. And so we were able to answer that person's question and know that when we have annual operating instructions that come from the grasslands, that as those questions come up, that we have the ability to work through that and make sure that the state school land and the carrying capacity and stocking rate that we put on it is being taken into consideration with their land management practices. And so that kind of opened those lines of communication where we started working together on some other issues. We had an access issue in the southwest corner of the state on a section line road that travel management had closed, going back to Chip's point, and we hadn't been involved in that process, hadn't submitted any public comments, but thankfully we were able to work with one of Dan's counterparts to get that road reopened, because it was the point of access that went into some school and public lands. And so those are just two quick examples with the grassland side of things, where we realized that we need to have open communication and work together on a lot of issues. And Dan's been great for that, as well as some of his other counterparts. And Chance mentioned the RAC. That's the Resource Advisory Council that the BLM has. And so about the same time I was working through some of those issues with Dan, I talked to my counterpart in North Dakota, and he recommended that I look at getting appointed to the RAC for the Dakotas. We have one RAC, it's the Dakota RAC for South Dakota and North Dakota. And so because we don't have as much BLM land in South Dakota, we have a shared RAC, but there are RACs across all of the western states. And it's really been a good experience to sit on that. I've only been on it a couple of years. Chance served 6 years, but a couple of times a year then we get together with Chip and also with some of the regional folks out of Montana and other places, and can talk through these types of issues. There's some county commissioners from Harding County on the board, some lessees and permittees and grazers. And so being able to have ranchers on there and sit down look at state lands, BLM lands has been very helpful. And it all kind of started there with some of the sage grouse stuff, which Chip mentioned, but as she gets into travel management and we have school land sections in the middle of a lot of BLM, we'll be working very closely together to make sure that we don't have section line roads or things that access those school and public lands, that we continue to have access, because our land is leased at a public auction. And so if we don't have access, it really restricts our ability to lease our land compared to some of the other leasing mechanisms. And so we have a really good relationship that we've developed in South Dakota, public and private, to be able to work through some of these issues. And so I appreciate them being here today and talking through some of those things. And with that, we'd open it up to questions from the audience.
Hi, Mike Wood with High Ridge Leadership. I'll be on a panel later on today. I'll start with kind of just an easy question for you guys, but I think it's worth talking about. There are lots of policies, there's lots of regulations that govern your work, especially in your world. A couple of you, Chance and Eric, you mentioned the sort of the ridiculous nature of some of those processes that you get put into. I know Chip probably deals with that on a regular basis too, I'm sure, as does Dan, obviously. But my question to you is this is the leading part, this is the easy part of it. How important are personal relationships and developing trust amongst each other relative to following the policies and regulations? In other words, where do you spend most of your time and energy? Is it the regulations and policies that are going to get us where we need to be, or is it the relationships that you develop?
I'm not exactly sure how to approach that, because the policies sort of are what they are. You know, we are mandated to do those things. Having said that, talking straightforward to people and just saying what's out there rather than giving kind of the bureaucratic answer is what creates trust relationships. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here. Creates trust relationships with folks that you're dealing with on a day in, day out basis. So I think that Chance and others feel like when they walk into our office, they're going to get a straight answer and not just the bureaucratic answer. Yeah, it takes a long time to do what we do. The previous discussion that we had about streamlining NEPA, I'd be all for that. However, as public land managers, I think that we have a responsibility and a duty to make sure that we go through some sort of process to do our jobs reasonably and responsibly. I mean, this is public land. You know, we're just the caretakers of it, and so we have a responsibility. And this is going to sound completely bureaucratic, but we do have a responsibility to the public and to the people of this country to take care of their resource. You know, so. The policy things at Catch-22, I think that we wouldn't be able to do our job nearly so well if it wasn't for the relationships that we have, and that I can't take credit for personally. It's my staff that has done it, has created the relationships with the people in the state. So, I don't know what you want to.
Well, I guess I'd like I guess the thing, the trust thing, and it's I don't know, I guess call it institutional memory or whatever, but so many times there's such a revolving door of, you know, the BLM people, they do a 5-year stint and they're gone. And whereas the rancher, you know, we've been there forever and we remember what it was like. But then every time you get a new range person or then you start over, and so that's a challenge. But you know, and once in a while you get one that you hope leaves before the 5 years, but by and large we've been really lucky with the people that have been at the BLM, and they've done a good job, but there is kind of I don't know, you want to call it a training process. So.
Oh, I very definitely agree with that.
Yeah, question.
Can I just say a couple words on that? It very much is about the relationship and trust. And like Chance said, there's the personnel revolve through. And it's important to get to know your range cons or techs very well. You know, they can look through the file, and Forest Service is very good about keeping paperwork and putting that in your file. They can look through the file and kind of get a sense of what kind of permittee and what kind of allotment you have. And so it's important that you maintain a good relationship with each and every staff member, whether you agree with them or not, but to have a good relationship with them. And so you can start out on a good note with the next new guy. You know, there are some regulations that are flexible and some are inflexible. The on-off dates are pretty inflexible. That's where they need to be. There's some other things, you know, some utilization standards. I mean, they're pretty set, but you know, depending on your grazing program, you can move those around a little bit. So, you know, you just kind of have to learn and develop that relationship and go that way. But I always approached it from the standpoint that Forest Service staff member was my landlord, and he's looking, or he or she is looking out for the land. I mean, they want to protect the land and keep it in good condition. My family was up there for close to 50 years, and that was very important to us also to keep that in very good condition. So we were working the same way, and you had to approach it that way, that, you know, and make sure that they realize that you're approaching it that same way. And you know, we're all working towards the same goal. And I think that was always very important in dealing with it.
Can I add to that, Ryan? You hit the nail on the head. I mean, that personal relationship is overwhelmingly important. I was talking to Mr. Jensen before the meeting started. He's worked all over the world. I've worked several places in the Western US, and we were talking about how personalities matter, and personalities matter because of that. So for all the agencies I've worked for and all the states I've worked in, if you can start with that point of mutual respect. And I often think of, I think it's a Will Rogers quote that I've never met a man I didn't like. And my grandma Dietz, who always said that you could disagree with somebody without cussing. And I often wonder, Will Rogers and Grandma Dietz did not meet some of the people that I've met, right? But that doesn't obviate the need to have that mutual respect to get that, whatever collaboration can come out of that, it has to start there.
I would say if you hear these guys say this is the direction we've received from Washington, cut them a break, because they getting directions that they know that they have to follow the process that they have. So,
You know, but having said that, it's our job to make sure that we explain what we've been told by Washington so people get it. I mean, we can't just say, nope, this is what we've got to do and it's going to take us 2 years or whatever to do it. Explain what it is that we're doing so people understand, you know, we're not just twiddling our thumbs, really. You said there was a more difficult part to your question?
No, that was I guess it's an easy question to answer for all work.
Right, yeah.
But I agree, man, just one last thing. I think that the work that I do, I talk a lot with Forest Service employees, and that is one of the central messages that they, on the internal side of the organization in the Forest Service, it is so essential that, and I work a lot with mid-career employees, that they understand the why behind the directives. And that's an ongoing conversation just for you, those of you that don't. I have a kind of a bird's eye view into the organization that I'll talk to later on, but those of you that aren't aware, there's an ongoing conversation, I mean, all over the place and within the Forest Service, I'm sure in the BLM as well. How do you translate those messages accurately out into the field, and so that the people in the field really do know the why behind the policies? Because I think that everyone does recognize that's the essential part of your interfacing with folks that have commingled lands or whoever you're interfacing with. That's so essential that you understand the why at your levels and below you.
And in an effort to translate that information to the public, and specifically, we were addressing the subject of why it takes so long to do an environmental assessment, and why, well, we often get someone coming in the door and say, hey, I want to put in a pipeline, I want to put in a fence, I want to dig a pit, and I want to do it tomorrow. We're like, not so much, you know? So what we've done in my office to try to clarify that process was we put together basically a 1-sheet bullet list of, in order to start this process, this is what we need from you. Here's the things that we've got to do, and here's what you've got to do. And then from that point, here's what's going to happen, and then here's what's going to happen, and then we'll get to the end. And that's probably going to take X long, depending on what the project is. So we have got those documents that we've put together, and we're going to start giving out to all of our project proponents when they bring something through the door, so that they don't have that tomorrow expectation. So.
Okay, it's been a while. I had a question. I had to think to myself what my question was. Jeff Parrott, Wheeler Lumber. I have a 2-part question, one for Eric and Chance as landowners, and then a second part for the agencies. As you work with multiple agencies at the federal and state level, do you ever discuss with those agencies about the other agency has a better process than you do? What can we do to fix that? And number 2, the state and federal agencies, do you get together and discuss your policies such as NEPA and list goes on about, you know, what our process is, the differences between those processes, and how we can make it better for everyone?
An answer, your direct answer to your question, Jeff, I don't know that we've really discussed that the different agencies have better processes as much. I know that Chance and I have spent a lot of time in the back of a horse, and we have discussed individually and together about how much better we could make the whole process. So yeah, that's we had that down pretty good. But, you know, I look at what we're trying to do on some of our public lands with you know, some of the developments we're trying to do, and the travel management and the NEPA process that we have to go through, and the whole system is really flawed. My deal is that we need to have a lot more local control in that whole process, because it's the local managers that have the history on the land that really understand how that land is going to react to different management practices. And the NEPA process is set up that everybody in the country has influence, has really supposedly the equal amount of influence. So, you know, you take Chance's outfit, for example, those shale breaks in Owl Creek are a very unique ecosystem. And somebody from New Hampshire can look at a picture of those shale breaks and think, my gosh, those cows have destroyed that land, thinking that that land should be capable of looking like their backyard in New Hampshire. And it's just, it can't happen that way. It's just not capable of that. Chance understands better than anybody how to manage those shale breaks. So he should get a far greater standing when it comes to managing in that. You know, I think that I'm probably the same way in the Black Hills. I have a pretty clear idea of what needs to occur to accomplish our goals. And I would like to think that I have a greater standing in when it comes to the allotment management plans than other people, but the Forest Service, they have to follow the rules that they have set down for them, and they really can't give me any more standing. You know, I'm sure that they try to work it in if I have reasonable ideas, but it's not elevated to that point. The county should have a greater standing. The states, you know, the states are kind of a slippery slope. I think in South Dakota, we're very lucky to have a common sense management style here. We have a very good extension department, forestry department from the Department of Agriculture that understands management in the Black Hills and in the region, in the surrounding region. So I think the state should be given a greater authority in managing those public lands. But you know, just to reiterate, the historical aspects of dealing with people that have been here for a long time is paramount in managing these lands.
Yeah, and I guess I just like to add on to that. I mean, that's, you know, the stakeholders part of that and the local control. And I mean, when we did the resource plan, and I think the local BLM staff was as frustrated as I was, because they spent countless hours on that, and then it got rewritten upstairs, and which, you know, could have saved us 5 years if they just sent that document and we didn't. But anyway, that's, you know, but I guess, you know, the stakeholders thing, the way I heard it described, it's the difference between ham and eggs. You know, the chicken is interested. The pig is committed to the process.
We'll talk about that later.
How do you follow that?
Would you reiterate the part that you wanted Chip and I to address?
Was asking, we have, you know, state and federal agencies here in front, and I was wondering if you all get together at any point to discuss differences in your policies and regulations, and what one may be better than the other. Can we make changes to that policy in DC if we go to them and with those types of recommendations?
I'll start kind of from a state perspective, but I'm going to use some examples of kind of, well, the first one I'll use is what I already mentioned with our utilization rates and our carrying capacity. You know, we had a lessee bring it up to us, and so that facilitated us getting together and discussing what our processes were. Same thing with the road access on section lines, with our land being leased at public auction. And so we don't necessarily, with the Grasslands, Dan and I don't have a regularly scheduled meeting, but as these issues come up, because of our relationship and communication, you know, we discuss those things as they come along. One area we had a couple of meetings on with one of Dan's counterparts down in Hot Springs. We had 3 meetings this fall trying to do some better management with prairie dogs, and trying to streamline where we've got encroachment issues from grasslands going on to school lands. You can do some setbacks if there's private lands, but their federal plan exempted out school lands, and that was written a long time ago, and the plan is the plan. But we're working on some other ideas for ways we can try and limit, and we can't eliminate it, but try and limit and restrict the encroachment that's occurring, because that's impacting our lessee who's paying us rent. And so their processes are different. And going to what Dan said about mutual respect, you know, we respect their processes. That is their land, but appreciate them being willing to work with us to try and limit it to the degree that they can with the flexibility that they have. With the BLM stuff, earlier this summer, I wasn't able to make it, but I got a letter from Chip with all of the BLM allotments that they were going to be doing an evaluation, right? Is that the right word? An evaluation, or looking at looking at the grazing in the allotments. And then if I wanted to come along, you know, I could look at that and try and look at our co-mingled lands where we're trying to evaluate the grazing on our school lands. Now, I wasn't able to make it, but you know, just being invited, and they do that every year. And so next summer I'm going to try and make it out to kind of look at their process for when they're evaluating their allotments, and be able to look at that. And the other thing with BLM, we've taken some of their information on oil and gas in particular to blend rates for reclamation of plugged and abandoned oil and gas sites. And so some of that stuff, we didn't really have anything in policy. We just had reclaim the land. And so we've tried to be a little bit more proactive in setting out some recipes for a native grass mix. And BLM had a pretty good one. And so we've tried to implement that and be a little bit better. So there's just a couple of examples. Some of the longer processes like NEPA and some of that, I don't have to deal with, thankfully. Our state laws are a little bit friendlier to being able to do some different things. But you know, we definitely have been getting together and talking through a variety of those issues. And the last one I mentioned is prescribed burning. You know, I've been in contact. Dan did a prescribed burn last summer, and I got, email after email and update after update after update, which I don't think you can get too many updates when that kind of event is occurring. But, Dan was very good at reaching out and keeping us in the loop because we had some school land nearby, as well as when there were a couple of lightning strikes this summer. Dan sent me some GIS maps of where those lightning strikes were. So that's not necessarily a process, but again, when you start talking about having fires and things like that, that type of coordination is good so we're all on the same page.
Yeah, and I guess I would answer your question on how much we meet. As a professional bureaucrat, the one resource that is not limiting is the number of meetings. So in my present position, I don't have a regular meeting with other land managers, but I do make a point to go meet with each of the county commissions every year or two so that we can compare notes. Again, we have a meeting with our neighbor, the Lower Brule tribe, every year so we can compare notes. To get to your specific question, I think a great example would be here on the Black Hills National Forest, and maybe Mark or Craig can speak to that. They've had a standing regular meeting for different land managers for many years, and that was the genesis of the All Lands Initiative. Craig or Mark, can you flesh that out?
Yeah, sure. We did. I mean, certainly a number of annual coordination meetings, but we'll talk about tomorrow in the panel. And it really went from coordination to collaboration to really look at what each interested party, whether they had jurisdictional responsibility or just an interest in the public, to weigh in and provide the advice on really complex issues. And so I think that was that shift we'll talk about tomorrow, is how do we roll up our sleeves and really figure out how we can best all work together.
And just as a quick summary, I took your question to be a little bit different. Maybe you might correct me if I'm wrong, but were you asking about the process specifically, like how we do NEPA, or about collaboration on the planning process?
More regarding policy and different processes and policies and the variances from state to federal. The point being that, to make things better, can we say, and I know this has been talked about before, well, we want the state to run the national forest within their state, or something along those lines, or the forest is managed under state rules, and those sorts of things, and I hate to use the phrase thinking outside the box, but go a different way and discuss, how can we do those types of interagency policy decisions and keep it more, as Eric said, at the local level.
I can't honestly say that I've had those discussions, no. No. I'm not sure exactly how to answer the question, but other than what we've already done, other than what's already been said, yeah.
Okay. If it's quick, yes. Is that a deal?
Not sure. It might be, because it might not be much of an answer. This is just something I've been curious about, and maybe Chip, you mentioned greater sage-grouse planning, and as I read some of the BLM IMs for how we were going to deal with sage-grouse in priority areas, it looked to me like there was thought about doing the NEPA process in such a way that there were population and landscape goals that were going to be put out there, and that we would develop the NEPA process with a variety of alternatives and hard and soft triggers where we might jump between alternatives based on a collaboration to try to achieve goals. And I was wondering if that might allow more flexibility, like a private landowner does, where he plays with timing, frequency, duration, intensity of stocking to achieve land management goals. Do you think there might be a way to make the NEPA process more flexible to achieve landscape goals?
Well, if we're talking specifically about sage grouse, there are a lot of triggers where sage grouse is concerned, and I don't think we have the time here to get into all the ins and outs of the calculations of doing sage grouse. But there is a 3% disturbance cap on sage grouse, and that is calculated over all of the landscape, but the effect of it is only going to be on public lands. So there is a number of things that can be done management-wise. Say, for example, if it's an oil and gas issue, you can only have one oil and gas type situation within a 640-acre section area. So, all right, so you co-locate some things on the same well pad and do some things like that that can work out very well. And that makes NEPA easy, even if it's in priority habitat. So there's some flexibility. There's some very hard lines, however, on things that we can and can't do. Where the state comes into play on sage grouse, they manage the bird. We fully recognize and appreciate the state's authority over wildlife species. Ours is strictly the habitat, and I think that we're going to get into prescribed burn discussions, which I'm sure sage grouse probably is part of that later in the day. So I do think that there's some ways to do NEPA quicker in sage grouse, and I think it's built into the plan. Now, is that plan necessarily easy? No, it's not, and it's very convoluted. So
you see that as sort of that might be a process that would allow NEPA to be more adaptable. And I'm thinking of it, making it more adaptable for a broader range of not just wildlife issues, but land health issues.
I think that it's a model that could be followed. Yes. Has that been done? Not so much. So, yeah, I like the idea though very much.
That's a tough one because
It
you
is.
are going back to the statute, and when you're working with these land managers, it's you can have the best relationship in the world, but when they have a statutory requirement, a set of statutory requirements they have to go through, they can't cut those corners because you'll get slapped with litigation, and everything you were trying to accomplish gets potentially thrown out the door at that point. So it's, as was mentioned earlier, you do have to start at that point thinking about the underlying structure and looking at how to make that more effective. We're going to cut this discussion off and take a short break. If everybody, about 5 minutes, if we're back here at a quarter